For centuries, they were the nightmare of Europe, the Ottoman Janissaries. In battle, they were unstoppable machines. With prisoners, they were merciless executioners. But the Janissaries were not just an army. They were a social experiment unlike anything the world had ever seen. They were an exotic paradox, the elite slaves. Recruited from Christian families in the Slavic lands and the Balkans, they were legally the Sultan's property, yet they held the power to make or break him. Rumors whispered that these holy warriors didn't shy away from forbidden wine. They didn't march behind flags, they marched behind giant soup cauldrons. And they didn't fight in silence, they charged to the terrifying beat of the world's first military bands. They were the empire's deadliest weapon, until they aimed that weapon at the empire itself.
All right, let's start where the whole story really begins. Before the uniforms, before the drums, before the cauldrons and the mustaches and the scary reputation. Back when the Janissaries were just boys, just kids basically, pulled out of ordinary villages, thrown into the most intense social experiment of the early modern world. And I'm warning you up front, this chapter is going to run on a contradiction. That contradiction is the engine of everything later: tragedy and opportunity, kidnapping and promotion, suffering and status, all in the same pipeline. The Ottomans built that pipeline with cold logic and with a kind of brutal genius. They called it Devshirme. People translate it as the collection, but for families living through it, it felt like a tax paid in flesh. So blood tax is the phrase you'll hear a lot, and it sticks because it's emotionally true. Now, quick rewind. In the 1300s and 1400s, the Ottoman state is still young and hungry. It expands fast into former Byzantine lands. It pushes across the Balkans. That means it suddenly rules huge Christian populations: Greeks, Serbs, Bulgarians, Albanians, and plenty of others. And that creates a problem every expanding empire runs into sooner or later. How do you build a loyal, professional core? How do you do that when your ruling group is relatively small and when your new subjects have their own identities, their own elites, their own local loyalties? The classic solution is to lean on tribal allies or feudal cavalry or mercenaries, but those come with strings attached. The Ottomans wanted something cleaner. They wanted something that belonged only to the Sultan. They wanted a force that couldn't be captured by local power networks. So they did something that sounds insane until you think like an empire. They went fishing for loyalty inside conquered Christian communities. They took boys, yes, forcibly in many cases, and they remade them. Language, religion, name, identity, the whole thing. And the end product was a soldier who, in theory, had no family power base, no tribal chief, no local landlord, no village obligation. He was the Sultan's man, literally the Sultan's property. That's not a metaphor. Legally and socially, these recruits became cool, the Sultan's slaves. And this is our first big, wait, what moment. These are slaves who become elite. Elite slaves isn't clickbait, it's the point. Imagine a system where the most feared core unit is made of kids taken from outside the dominant culture, then trained so thoroughly they become the ultimate insiders. A comparison that helps people picture the vibe is the Jedi. Recruited young, separated from family, trained in discipline, told they serve a higher purpose, originally not allowed to marry, not allowed to build outside loyalties, except here the Force is the Sultan's authority, and the lightsaber is a musket and a curved blade. And the twist, the reason we're even here, is that this Jedi-style system eventually produces something closer to Sith behavior. Powerful insiders who start acting like they get to choose the Emperor. But first, we have to see how a boy actually became a Janissary. Here's the part people often get wrong. Devshirme wasn't just random raiding. There were raids, sure, captives were taken in war, but by the 15th and 16th centuries, recruitment becomes more formal, more scheduled, more bureaucratic. Teams of officials show up, they inspect boys, they select boys, they send boys away. And if you picture it as chaotic medieval violence, it's actually creepier than that, because it's organized, it's paperwork, it's a state saying, we're entitled to your children. Selection mattered. They weren't taking just anyone. The goal was to harvest potential, strong bodies, sharp eyes, quick learners, boys who could be molded. And notice something important. This wasn't only about building soldiers, it was also about building a ruling machine. Because not every boy ended up in the same place. The Ottoman system split them into tracks, and this is where the golden ticket idea comes in. If you are a peasant family on the margins of an empire, your options are limited. You farm, you pay taxes, you try not to get crushed by war or famine. Then the state shows up. Yes, it can be devastating, but it also opens a door that basically didn't exist in medieval Europe in quite this way. A poor village kid might end up inside the palace system. He might learn languages, he might learn administration, he might learn how power actually works. He might rise into positions that put him within arm's reach of the throne. That's not meritocracy in the modern sense, but it is social mobility, violent, coerced, real. So the pipeline splits into three big outcomes. First, the palace school track, the truly elite education. The most promising boys get trained for administration and high service. These are the ones who can become top officials. Some could rise all the way to the very top of government. Second, the Janissary Corps proper, the infantry shock troops, the disciplined, standing force that gives the Ottomans a terrifying edge for centuries. Third, the bottom rung, the boys who don't make the cut, the ones who are weaker or less capable. They get pushed into hard labor and support roles, sometimes rowing in galleys, because an empire at war needs bodies everywhere, and the Mediterranean is a battlefield. That split reveals the Ottoman mindset. It wasn't just, we need soldiers. It was, we need a system that manufactures loyal talent. It's human engineering. Now, if you're thinking, okay, so everyone tried to hide their kids, yes, many did. Plenty of families saw the recruiters as a nightmare walking into the village. They tried to run, they tried to lie about ages, they tried to swap boys, they tried to bribe their way out. And this is where we hit one of the most fascinating parts of the whole story. It's the kind of paradox that makes people lean forward. Bribery worked in both directions. Let that sink in. In one village, a family pays money to keep their son from being taken. In another village, a family pays money to get their son taken. Same system, opposite incentives. And once you understand that, you understand a lot about how the Janissaries later become a political force. Because from day one, money and manipulation are already baked into the process. Let's break down the bribery paradox. On the first side, the obvious side, you've got fear. A child taken from his mother and father, marched away, shipped across water, basically erased and rebuilt. Families who had the means sometimes tried to bribe the recruiting team. Take someone else, say he's too young, say he's sick. Look, here's what I can pay. And recruiting teams had incentives too. Being on recruitment detail could be lucrative. It's not just salary, it's side money, extortion, fees, whatever you want to call it. Now, the other side, the golden ticket side. Some families, especially poor ones, looked at Devshirme and saw possibility. One less mouth to feed right now, but also a chance that your son ends up with a stable life, regular pay, status, maybe influence. That's why you find Balkan memories that are complicated, grief mixed with a strange, reluctant pride. And here's the detail that really snaps people awake. Sometimes Muslim families also tried to bribe officials to get their sons into the pipeline, even though the formal logic was, we take Christian boys. Why would a Muslim family want that? Because being the Sultan's slave could mean being inside the strongest ladder in the empire. It's social climbing through a door that technically wasn't meant for you. It's the kind of sentence you say out loud and people blink. Muslim parents bribed officials so their sons could be taken into slavery. That's the level of contradiction we're dealing with, and it forces you to realize something. Slavery isn't one simple category in every society. In this imperial system, slave of the ruler could mean dependent of the ruler. And in many empires, that's exactly how you create loyal, ambitious, highly trained people who owe everything upward. Now let's talk about what happens after selection. The emotional shock is one thing. The machine that follows is what makes the Janissaries different. The journey matters. Recruits are removed from their regions, often transported to Anatolia, sometimes by ship. That physical distance is part of the method. It's not just relocation, it's cutting the cord. Once you're across the water, running back isn't realistic. Then comes the remaking process. Language first, Turkish, because you can't build a new identity if the old language is still running your mind. Religion next, Islam, because the state wants the recruit's spiritual and social loyalty aligned with the ruling order. Then discipline, routine, obedience. And I want you to picture it not as a flashy montage, picture it as slow and relentless. Years of repetition, years of correction, years of being told the same ideas until they become reflex. The Sultan is your father. Your brotherhood is your family. Your honor is your unit. Your future is service. The vibe is institutional identity replacing biological identity. Then the system sorts them. The brightest and most adaptable get pulled toward palace education. The strong and steady go into the Janissary infantry. The ones who can't keep up get pushed into labor roles, rowing, hauling, building, digging, because early modern armies are logistics machines, and the Ottomans used recruits for public works too, building ships, maintaining gardens, constructing mosques, doing the labor that keeps an empire moving, all while training. That's part of why this system produced a standing army with skills beyond just swinging a blade. Now, a lot of people miss how unusual that standing army element was for the era. For a long time in Europe, armies are seasonal and pieced together. Feudal lords, levies, mercenaries, city militias. The Ottomans are running a different model. They build a corps of full-time infantry trained from youth. That model makes them scary, not because they're superhuman, because they're consistent, and consistency wins wars. So by the 1400s and 1500s, Janissaries become the kind of unit enemies fear in advance. You can almost feel the dread in European accounts. If the Janissaries show up, this is going to be ugly. And the fear isn't only battlefield skill, it's the idea they have nothing else. No land, no village, no civilian fallback. at least in the original design. Their whole identity is service. That's why the Ottoman state invests in them. And that's also why, later, when that identity starts to crack, everything changes. When they're allowed to marry, when they own property, when they run businesses, the entire design was about concentrating loyalty and aligning interests. Okay, so before we move to Chapter 2, let's end with the same honest tease your intro uses. The features that make this system effective are the seeds of the disaster. Taking boys young creates intense loyalty. It also creates a brotherhood that can become its own power center. Making them elite slaves binds them to the Sultan. It also gives them elite leverage, elite entitlement, elite arrogance. And once you build the sharpest blade in the empire, you better be sure you can keep that blade pointed outward, because if it ever turns inward, if it decides it's not just a weapon but a kingmaker, then the empire hasn't built an army, it's built a problem with muskets. And next chapter, we get into the weirdest part of all, how this brotherhood organized itself like a kitchen, how it marched behind a cauldron, how a soup pot became a flag, and how flipping that pot became the universal sign for rebellion. Picture Istanbul at dawn, not the postcard version with tourists and seagulls, the working city version. Damp stone, wood smoke in the air, men shouting in courtyards, and somewhere behind a wall you hear metal clanking. A giant copper cauldron just got dragged across the ground. It sounds like it weighs as much as a small car, and in a way it does, because for the Janissaries, that cauldron isn't cookware, it's identity. And I know how that sounds. My flag is a soup pot. It sounds ridiculous, but it's also the perfect clue. This isn't a quirky tradition. It's how a corps holds itself together for centuries, and it's how it signals rebellion with one basic gesture. They flip dinner upside down. So let's talk about what it meant to be a Janissary when the system actually worked, back when it was, for lack of a better word, scary professional. The first thing you need to understand is that the Janissary Corps wasn't built like a normal army unit. It wasn't a place where you show up, do your shift, and go home to your family. It wasn't just a job. This was closer to a closed religious military fraternity that happened to be armed. It was part monastery, it was part boot camp, it was part political machine, and it was part gang. In the early period, it was the kind the state wants, loyal upward, brutal outward. In Chapter 1, we talked about Devshirme. We talked about the pipeline that takes kids and remakes them. Chapter 2 is what happens after the pipeline. It's how you keep thousands of men welded into one living organism. It's how you turn stolen children into a brotherhood that will walk into cannon fire without blinking. The answer is simple and chilling. You build their whole world inside the barracks. You make the corps their family. You make the Sultan their father, and you make daily routine feel sacred. The messaging is not subtle. The Sultan feeds you. The Sultan clothes you. The Sultan pays you. The Sultan owns you. And in return, you give him your entire life. And when you hear, "The Sultan is our father," don't hear it as poetry. Hear it as a program. The point is to replace the biological family with an imperial one. Now, barracks life. Imagine rows of men living together, eating together, training together, praying together, getting punished together, getting promoted together. You're not just comrades, you're roommates for life. You're watched, you're measured, you're corrected. Your social world is the unit. That kind of intensity creates discipline, but it also creates something more dangerous. It creates collective identity. The Janissaries are one of the clearest examples of what happens when you give a group shared trauma, shared ritual life, and a shared sense of superiority. It makes them unstoppable on campaign, and it makes them dangerous inside politics later when they decide they're not just soldiers. And the funny thing is, the Ottomans coded all of that seriousness inside food language. Their ranks sound like they came out of a kitchen. You'll see the title Çorbacı, often rendered as Çorbacı. It literally means soup maker. And in a Janissary context, that's basically your senior officer. It's the person you obey in the field and in the barracks. His assistants get kitchen labels too. The titles sound comedic, the reality is not. The point behind the joke is a worldview. In older Turkic and steppe traditions, a leader is somebody who feeds the group. Provisioning is leadership. If you can keep your people fed, you have legitimacy. The Janissaries kept that logic alive in their symbolism. And that brings us to the real star of this chapter, the Kazan, the cauldron. Each company, each orta, basically a unit within the corps, had its own big copper cauldron. Yes, it was used to cook, stew, soup, the daily food that makes barracks life possible. But at the same time, that cauldron was treated like a sacred object. It was carried in ceremony. It functioned like a flag. It embodied the honor of the unit. You don't lose the Kazan, not if you value your reputation. Losing it is disgrace. It means your unit has been humiliated. Now here's the part that matters for our story arc. The Janissaries developed a public language for revolt. One of the clearest signals was literally overturning the cauldron. Flip it, knock it, drag it out into the street, and everybody understands what you're saying. We reject the chain of command. We reject the usual order. We are in rebellion. It's both absurd and terrifying. There's no manifesto, there's no long speech, just men flipping a pot, and suddenly the palace knows the city might burn tonight. And sometimes it did. This is where we start seeing the Janissaries as something more than infantry. They're a political actor with its own rituals and signals. And when you have that, you have leverage. Now, the human part. What does it feel like to be inside this system? You're a kid who got stripped of your old life. You're thrown into a hyper-structured environment. You learn Turkish. You learn drill, you learn prayer, you learn discipline. Your body gets trained, your reflexes get trained, your emotions get trained, and you're rewarded for obedience with food, pay, status, and belonging. That belonging replaces what was taken. It's why so many Janissaries fought like men who didn't have anywhere else to go, because in a sense, they didn't. Originally, one of the big design features was that Janissaries were not supposed to marry, and they were not supposed to build civilian lives. This matters. Hold it in your head. The state wants them detached from local loyalties. No clan, no village obligations, no in-laws, no property network, just the core. When that rule breaks later, and it does, the balance shifts. But in the golden era, the discipline is real, the routine is real, and the Janissaries developed this attitude of, we are not like the rest. That attitude is reinforced by how the Ottoman system labels them. They are kapekulu, the Sultan's household troops, the inner circle of force. And when you're trained inside the household, you start to see provincial soldiers as rough and unreliable. You start to see ordinary peasants as irrelevant. You become an elite institution in a multinational empire, not a folk army. That's another reason outsiders struggled to read them. They weren't just the Turks. They were a state-made caste. Now, one of the best details is the harmless-sounding job titles that are actually terrifying. The court and the military loved this. Names that sound soft, roles that are anything but. The best example is the Bostanji, usually translated as gardeners. If you just hear the word, you picture guys trimming roses. But in reality, the Janissary Corps is palace security, its internal police, and sometimes its execution. They guard the imperial gardens, yes, but they also control access to the ruler. They patrol key areas around the palace and the Bosporus. They enforce order, and when necessary, they do the dirty work that keeps a dynasty alive. Gardener is a soft label for hard power. And you also hear names like Sekban, dog handlers. It sounds harmless too, but it points to armed service tied to the court world, guard duties, hunting duties, and over time, enforcement. The takeaway is simple. The empire takes household service roles and turns them into titles of force. The language of domestic work becomes the language of violence, and it fits the Janissary identity perfectly. Because they are a household corps as well. They are soldiers of the palace, not just soldiers of the empire. Now let's talk religion, because this is where the Janissaries stop being just soldiers and become their own culture. Officially, the empire is Sunni Muslim at the top. Islamic law matters. The ulema matter. There's an orthodox framework. But lived religion in a huge empire is always messier than the label. And the Janissaries are especially complicated. Many were born Christian, taken young, converted, trained. So their Islam is learned, institutional, drilled. And over time, many become associated with a Sufi order known as the Bektashi. Think mystical, think lodge-centered, think brotherhood. Sufi orders are not just beliefs, they're social networks, lodges, teachers, rituals, a second layer of belonging. For a corps built on solidarity, that's powerful. The Bektashi also had a reputation for being flexible and unorthodox in the eyes of more mainstream authorities, and that's where the stories come from. Stories that spread across Europe, stories that lived in Balkan memory. Janissaries drinking wine, Janissaries being relaxed about rules other Muslims took seriously, Janissaries being their own kind of Muslim. We should handle that carefully, not as cheap scandal, as a social marker, because in history, reputation is power. Whether every Janissary drank wine is not the point. The point is that enough people believed they lived by different rules that it became part of their identity. That identity connects to the Bektashi reputation for syncretism, meaning the ability to absorb and blend. When you convert huge numbers of people from one religious world into another, you don't erase habits overnight. You get blending. You get old symbols wearing new clothing. You get a new faith practiced with an accent. The Janissaries were full of men who had a before and after in their lives. So it's not shocking that their religious culture could be different, more lodge-centered, more brotherhood-centered, and in some stories, more tolerant of alcohol. Then there's the mustache thing, which is a visual marker that sticks. Janissaries are often described as wearing mustaches without the full beards associated with stricter religious style. History is messy. Not every detail is universal, but as an emblem, it works. The mustache becomes a badge of belonging. It says, "We are Janissaries," not "we are just ordinary believers." And that's the big theme. Their faith, like their rank titles, becomes another way of signaling we are a caste. You can also feel why this irritated other power centers. Religious scholars might see a corps with its own spiritual network.
Provincial notables might see men who don't live like normal people. Urban residents might see men who act above the law. And later, that becomes literally true. But in the Golden Era, the state tolerates a lot because the Janissaries deliver. Effectiveness buys you forgiveness. Now, bring it back to the kitchen one more time. Food in the barracks isn't just nutrition, it's ritual. The cauldron is the center of the unit's daily life. You eat from it, you gather around it, you identify with it. And the officer being soup maker isn't just a joke title, it's a way of saying leadership is provision. Leadership is keeping the group alive. And when that breaks, when food is short, when pay is late, when leaders are corrupt, the cauldron becomes political. Because grievances gather where the men gather, and the Janissaries, with their strong collective identity, can turn grievances into action fast. That's why the overturn the Kazan gesture matters. It turns private complaint into public crisis. Now, one last point that will matter later, especially when we get to Osman I and then to Mahmud I. The Ottoman rulers did not accidentally create a group that could challenge them. They knowingly created a group with concentrated power because they thought they could manage it. They thought the slave status would guarantee obedience. And for a long time it did. But the Janissaries had three things that made them dangerous in the long run. They were armed, they were organized, and they were inside the capital. Guns, unity, proximity. That's the recipe for a coup in any century, and the cauldron is the symbol of that recipe. It's the "we act together" object. Okay, so where does this leave us as we move into Chapter 3? We've built the Janissaries as a machine of loyalty and ritual, a brotherhood with kitchen ranks, a corps with a flag that's a pot, a religious network that makes them feel separate, an inner-city presence that makes them politically real. Now we need to take all of that into war, because this is where the Janissaries become a legend. And war for them isn't just killing, it's theater, it's noise, it's terror. It's the moment when the enemy hears drums and strange horns and realizes a little too late that they're not fighting a feudal levy, they're fighting a professional standing infantry that moves like a single creature. Next chapter is the sound of nightmare. The muskets, the Yatagan rush, the marine detachments on galleys, and the insane military band that turns the battlefield into something that feels like the end of the world. Let's leave the barracks for a second. Let's go outside the city walls. Let's go to the place where the Janissaries stop being a weird social experiment and turn into a European phobia. Because if Chapter 2 was about identity and ritual, Chapter 3 is about impact. It's about what it felt like to be on the other side of them. And I want you to picture a European army in the 1500s or 1600s. A lot of those forces are still stitched together from different parts. Noble cavalry, city militia, mercenaries who fight for pay, peasant levies who don't really want to be there. The Ottomans show up with something different. They show up with a standing infantry corps that trains as a profession. And that difference matters before the first shot is fired. It matters in the way they move. It matters in the way they hold formation. It matters in the fact that they're not seasonal, they're not temporary, they're not improvising. They are built for this. Now, people love to call the Janissaries the first modern standing army. That's a little too neat. History is never that neat. But they are an early example of something Europe learns to fear and then copy. A permanent, disciplined, state-fed infantry force. Men trained for years. Men who treat drill like religion. Men who fight together over and over and over again. And when you combine that with Ottoman logistics, Ottoman artillery, Ottoman engineering, you get an army that can do long campaigns, sieges, river crossings, fort building, supply chains. This isn't just raiding cavalry anymore.
This is a war machine. So what did the Janissaries actually do in battle? The simplest answer is that they were shock infantry. They were the guys you could send into the hardest place, the breach in a wall, the narrow street after a gate falls, the moment when chaos starts and discipline is the only thing keeping you alive. But they weren't just muscle. They were trained to be flexible. They could act as engineers, they could act as artillerists, they could hold ground, they could storm ground. They were the core that other parts of the army could pivot around. And then there's the weapon question, because the Janissaries sit right on that historical transition from arrows to gunpowder. Early on, you do see them with bows. That's normal for the region and the era. But what makes them famous, what makes them feel modern to Europeans, is firearms, muskets, matchlocks, gunpowder weapons that change the geometry of fear. And this is where your Turkish musketeers line works, because that's basically what they become in the Western imagination. Not romantic musketeers with feathered hats, but disciplined shooters with a reputation for being cold about it. Now I want to give you the classic Janissary rhythm in battle. It's simple, it's brutal, it's very human. Step 1, the shot. One good shot, aimed, not just noise, a deliberate attempt to remove a key person, an officer, a standard bearer, a guy holding the line together. And in a world where command and control is fragile, one bullet can feel like magic. It can decapitate morale. Step 2, the rush. After the shot, they don't hang back like a slow firing line. They surge forward, they close distance fast, and then you see the blades, the yataghan, the sabers, the knives that turn the fight into a personal thing. And the psychological trick is that the enemy has to process two different horrors at once. First, the invisible death of gunfire, then the immediate physical violence of a close-quarters charge. That combination is why they felt unstoppable. And I know someone in the audience will ask, were they really that good? The honest answer is that they were good for their time and for their system. They were professional, they were cohesive, they were used in the right moments, and their enemies often were not operating at the same level of consistent training. That gap matters. But it also changes over time. Europe eventually catches up. Europe builds its own permanent armies. Europe standardizes drill. Europe builds artillery systems that rival the Ottomans. And when that happens, Janissary magic starts to fade. But in this chapter, we're still in the era where their reputation is growing. Now, let's talk about the part people remember even when they forget the dates: the sound. Because the Janissaries didn't arrive quietly. They arrived with a soundtrack. And this is not a small detail. This is psychological warfare. The meter band, drums, zurnas, trumpets, cymbals. A wall of noise that doesn't just mark time, it announces doom. It tells the enemy, we're here. It tells the city behind the walls, you're next. It tells the Ottoman soldiers, you're part of something bigger. And it's hard to explain to modern people how shocking this could feel, because we live in a world of speakers and sirens and constant sound. But imagine you're a European infantryman who has never heard anything like it. You're used to maybe a few drums, maybe a horn. Not this. Not the ground vibrating. Not the sense that the army is a moving machine with its own heartbeat. European sources talk about the emotional effect, fear, confusion, that feeling of being overwhelmed before the fighting even starts. And yes, you get stories, maybe exaggerated, about men going insane from the noise. I treat those stories as folklore with a purpose. The purpose is to communicate trauma. People use dramatic language to describe experiences that felt beyond normal human scale. The important point is that the sound worked. It took ordinary fear and turned it into panic. And panic kills. Panic breaks formations. Panic makes people run at the worst possible time. And notice how this connects back to Chapter 2. The Janissaries are all about ritual. They are all about coordinated identity. The cauldron, the ranks, the brotherhood, the Bektashi vibe, the mustache. All of that is internal culture. The meter is the external projection of that culture. It's the empire broadcasting itself. It's intimidation as performance. Now, I want to talk about a part of the Janissary story that gets overlooked: the marine detachments. Because when we say Ottoman army, we usually imagine land battles, planes, sieges, marches. But the Ottomans are also a Mediterranean power. The sea matters, galleys matter, islands matter, coastal fortresses matter. And on those galleys, you often have Janissaries, not as rowers, as fighters, as the boarding force, as the disciplined infantry you want when ships collide and the battle becomes a floating street fight. That's the thing about galleys. Naval combat in that world is not long-range cannon duels like later centuries. It's closing distance, ramming, grappling, boarding. And in a boarding action, you want the same thing you want in a breach. You want men who don't hesitate. You want men who move as a unit. So the Ottomans use experienced Janissaries as marine troops, and Europeans notice. Because if you're fighting on the deck of a ship, there's nowhere to run. You can't scatter into a field. You can't retreat behind a hill. It's close, it's violent, it's personal. And Janissaries were built for that. So by this point, the Janissaries are not just a military unit, they're a brand. They are the empire's signature fear, and that fear is reinforced by real events. They're associated with major sieges and major battles. They're linked to the fall of cities. They're the first wave through breaches. They're the men who plant the empire's reality inside conquered spaces. Even when the rest of the Ottoman army is doing the heavy lifting, the Janissaries get the legend, because legends attach to the sharp tip of the spear. But here's the pivot that we have to keep in view, because this is the whole tragedy of the story. The same things that make them terrifying on the battlefield also make them powerful inside the state: discipline, cohesion, identity, proximity to the capital, a sense of entitlement, a belief that they are the empire's true defenders. If you tell a corps for 200 years you are the best, eventually they start believing we should be in charge. So as we head into Chapter 4, watch the timing, watch the rules change, watch the marriage ban loosen, watch property ownership creep in, watch sons inherit positions, watch brotherhood turn into class. Because the sound of nightmare doesn't disappear overnight, it gets domesticated. It moves into the streets of Constantinople. And once the nightmare moves inside the city, it stops being Europe's problem. It becomes the empire's problem. At some point, every elite unit faces the same problem. Success changes the people inside it. And then it changes what the unit is allowed to do. And then, quietly at first, it changes what the unit expects. The Janissaries are a perfect example of that slow, deadly shift. Because the early corps is built on a very specific design: no family ties, no property, no local roots. A closed life, a barracks life, a brotherhood, a weapon that belongs to the Sultan. And for a long time, it works. It works almost too well. The Janissaries win. They survive. They gain status. They gain privilege. They gain a reputation that scares people before the battle even begins. And then the empire starts making compromises, small ones, practical ones, the kind that feel harmless in the moment, the kind that later look like the beginning of the end. The big turning point comes in the late 16th century. The rules around marriage begin to loosen. The barrier between the corps and civilian life starts to crack. And this matters more than any single battle, because once you let a Janissary build a family, you've changed his incentives, you've changed his daily life, you've changed the way he thinks about risk, you've changed the way he thinks about loyalty. A man who is supposed to be owned by the Sultan now has a wife, he has children, he has responsibilities that don't live inside the barracks. And once that happens, the corps stops being a closed world. It becomes a social class. At first, this shift can look like a minor reform, like a human concession. These men serve for decades, they bleed for the state, they live hard lives, so the state relaxes the rules. Fine, reasonable. But then the second consequence hits. The sons start showing up. Because once you allow Janissaries to marry and own property, you've also created something families want to inherit. And you can almost see how it happens. A Janissary father looks at his boy and thinks, why should my son struggle like a peasant? Why should he be just another shop worker? Why shouldn't he have the uniform, the pay, the privileges? And suddenly the corps is no longer primarily fed by Devshirme, it's fed by nepotism, by connections, by inheritance, by paper, by bribery. And the identity shifts. The Janissaries begin as outsiders made into loyal insiders. They slowly become insiders who reproduce themselves. This is the moment when elite slaves starts to become a joke, not to outsiders, to the Janissaries themselves. Because the old idea was, you are the Sultan's property. You have no other life. You have no other loyalty. But now these men have lives. They have shops. They have families. They have neighborhoods. They have local allies. They have economic interests. And once they have that, the relationship with the Sultan changes. It becomes negotiation. It becomes pressure. It becomes politics. Now let's talk about Istanbul itself, because the capital is where this change becomes visible. Early on, the Janissaries are a disciplined force stored in the city like a weapon in a rack, kept close, fed, paid, ready. But as the decades pass, the barracks are no longer just barracks. They're a social hub, a place where networks form, a place where favors get traded, a place where jobs get arranged. And outside the barracks, Janissaries start living more like civilians. They open businesses, they join guilds, they run shops, they trade goods. They become part of the urban economy. And in a way, that sounds normal. Soldiers have always had side hustles, but here it's not a side thing. It becomes the main thing. Training becomes optional. Military readiness becomes a slogan. The uniform becomes a license. And once the uniform is a license, corruption spreads, because the corps is full of people who want the status without the discipline, people who want the pay without the drill, people who want the privileges without the battlefield. And the system starts rewarding the wrong behaviors. Promotions can be bought, leaves can be bought, assignments can be bought, exemptions can be bought. And when officers buy their positions, the respect that held the whole machine together starts to evaporate. A corps built on discipline cannot survive long if nobody believes in its leadership. There's also a deeper shift here. The Janissaries were designed as a solution to the empire's loyalty problem, but once they become a hereditary class, they become a new loyalty problem, because now they have group interests that are not identical to the Sultan's interests. They begin to think in terms of their corporate privileges, their collective pay, their exemptions, their place in the city, their political voice. And every time the empire faces stress, the Janissaries learn a lesson. If we threaten disorder, we get concessions. If we gather in the streets, we get bonuses. If we show we can cause trouble, the palace listens. That's the crack in the armor. It's not one dramatic moment, it's a pattern. The state needs the Janissaries, so the state gives them things. The Janissaries accept, then they demand. The palace compromises again, and each compromise teaches the core that it can push farther. Over time, this becomes a feedback loop, and the feedback loop produces a new kind of Janissary, not the boy raised to obey, the adult raised to bargain. The man who sees himself not as a tool of the Sultan, but as a stakeholder in the empire. And stakeholders don't like reforms that threaten their stake. This is also when the Janissaries' internal culture starts changing. The old myth was purity, no wives, no property, no distractions. But the new reality is messy. Family life means less time in barracks. Business means less time training. Local ties mean more outside influence. And that influence can be political, it can be factional, it can be religious, it can be economic. The core becomes less uniform and more diverse in motivation. Some are still serious soldiers, some are basically civilians wearing military privilege. And that mix is dangerous because it creates a core that is large, loud, and politically active, but not necessarily militarily effective. And here's the brutal irony. The empire responds to military pressure from outside by increasing the core in size. More Janissaries, more payroll, more influence. But the quality is not rising with the quantity. The discipline is not rising with the size. So you get the worst combination: a core that is expensive, a core that is privileged, a core that is politically powerful, and a core that is gradually less useful on the battlefield. When you want a single image for this chapter, it's this. The Janissary stops being a man who lives for the core. He becomes a man who uses the core. He uses it as a job. He uses it as insurance. He uses it as status. He uses it as leverage. And once enough men think that way, the institution is no longer a weapon, it's a lobby, it's a guild, it's a machine for extracting benefits, and it won't give those benefits up peacefully. So as we move into Chapter 5, keep one question in mind. What happens when a young ruler finally looks at this system and says no? What happens when a sultan tries to take the weapon back? What happens when he tries to build a new army that doesn't depend on these men? Because that is where the story turns from slow decay to open violence. And it's where we meet one of the most tragic figures in the whole saga, Osman II, a teenager, a ruler with big plans, and a ruler who learns, in the most brutal way possible, what happens when the empire's slaves decide they're the masters. Osman II is where this story stops being an institutional tragedy and turns into a personal one. Because now we're not talking about slow corruption or shifting incentives. We're talking about a teenager on the throne. We're talking about a young ruler who looks around and realizes the empire's sharpest weapon has gone dull. And then he makes the mistake that young rulers always make. He says the quiet part out loud. He tries to fix it fast. and the people who benefit from the broken system hear him, and they panic. Osman comes to power very young. He's still basically a kid, and he inherits an empire that is huge but stressed. Wars cost money, campaigns expose weaknesses, and in the 17th century, those weaknesses are becoming harder to ignore. The Janissaries are still feared as a name, they still have prestige, they still have privilege. But on campaign, Osman sees what that prestige is hiding. He sees indiscipline. He sees men who care more about pay and perks than drill. He sees units that don't behave like the legendary corps in the stories. He sees a force that can bully the capital, but can't always deliver the same performance in the field. And when a ruler sees that, he starts thinking in a very straightforward way. If the old tool doesn't work, build a new one. Osman's idea is not complicated. He wants a new army. He wants soldiers trained differently. He wants a force that is loyal to him and actually effective. He looks at the Janissaries and he sees an interest group. He sees a class. He sees men who can veto policy with street violence. And he decides the only way forward is to reduce their monopoly on force. Now, even the rumor of that kind of plan is enough to shake the city, because the Janissaries understand exactly what it means. A new army means competition. Competition means losing privileges. Losing privileges means losing money. Losing money means losing power. And once a corps has tasted power inside the capital, it will fight harder to keep that power than it ever fought on a battlefield. So opposition grows, and it grows fast. This is the part people need to feel emotionally. Osman isn't fighting an external enemy. He's fighting the people who are supposed to protect him. He's trying to reform the very institution that holds weapons within walking distance of his palace. And he's doing it as a young man, without the long authority of an older, battle-tested ruler. He doesn't have decades of personal loyalty built up. He has a crown, he has ambition, he has an idea, and he has enemies with muskets in the streets. The revolt comes like these revolts often do. It starts with tension, with rumor, with grievances, with soldiers gathering, with commanders calculating. And then suddenly it's not a rumor anymore. It's a crowd. It's shouting. It's marching. It's the atmosphere in the city changing in a single day. A capital has a smell when it's about to explode. People close shops. People stay inside. People listen at windows. And the Janissaries move through the streets like they own them, because by this point, they kind of do. Osman is trapped in a position that is almost impossible. If he cracks down too early, he risks triggering a larger uprising. If he hesitates, he looks weak. And weakness is a language the Janissaries understand very well. They test him, they push, they demand, and when they feel he won't or can't smash them immediately, they escalate. Then the unthinkable happens. The slaves overthrow the Sultan. That's the inversion at the center of the whole Janissary story. A system designed to create obedient servants produces men who decide they can remove the master. They seize Osman. They strip him of authority. They replace him. And at that moment, the empire crosses a line. Because a corps that can kill a sultan is no longer a military institution. It's a political kingmaker. It's a veto power. It's a threat hanging over every future ruler. The most painful part is where Osman ends up. Yedikul, a grim place, heavy walls. A place meant to hold important prisoners. A place that, in this case, becomes a stage for something far darker. The young ruler is isolated. He's helpless. He's surrounded by men who were supposed to be his household troops. And whatever he says, whatever he promises, it's too late, because the logic of the revolt has moved beyond negotiation. Once a group takes down a sultan, it has to finish the job, because leaving him alive creates a rallying point, a symbol, a future revenge. So Osman II is killed, a teenager, a ruler who tried to reform a broken system, and he dies at the hands of his own soldiers. It's hard to overstate how shocking that is in the political culture of the time. The Ottoman dynasty is supposed to be sacred power. The Janissaries are supposed to be the Sultan's household slaves, and yet here they are, physically murdering the person they are built to protect. This is why Osman II matters so much to our narrative, because it proves something in the most dramatic way possible. The Janissaries are no longer just a crack in the armor, they are a blade at the Sultan's throat. After this, every ruler knows the truth. If you move too fast, if you threaten the core, if you talk about reform in the wrong way, they can destroy you. And that fear shapes the entire 17th century. It shapes the politics of the capital. It shapes the way officials behave. It shapes the way reforms get delayed, watered down, disguised, or abandoned. Because now the Janissaries aren't only an obstacle, they are a precedent. They are a reminder written in blood that the empire's elite soldiers can turn into executioners. So Chapter 5 ends with a bleak lesson. The empire created a force to solve its loyalty problem. That force became a class. That class became a political actor. And now that actor has done the one thing that changes everything. It killed a sultan. And once you cross that line, the next chapters almost write themselves, because the core doesn't go back to being obedient after tasting regicide. It goes forward. It becomes more confident, more entitled, more embedded in the city, more comfortable using violence as negotiation. And that's how we arrive at the next stage of the story. The Janissaries not just as soldiers, but as the gangsters of Constantinople. By the time you get into the 17th and 18th centuries, the Janissaries feel less like an elite army and more like a permanent fact of urban life. They're everywhere. They're in the streets, they're in the markets, they're in the coffee houses, they're in the guilds, and they're still in uniform, at least on paper, which is the whole problem, because a uniform is supposed to mean discipline and readiness. Here, it starts meaning immunity and influence. This is the era when people begin describing them in a way that sounds modern, not guardians, not holy warriors, more like a mafia, more like a protection racket. And that comparison isn't just for drama, it fits because the mechanics are similar. A group with violence on its side embeds itself into the economy. It offers protection, it extracts money, it punishes resistance, it makes itself too costly to remove. And the city adapts around it, the way cities always adapt around power. One reason the Janissaries could do this is simple. They are concentrated in the capital. They can mobilize quickly. They can gather in large numbers. They can intimidate officials who live nearby. And they understand the politics of proximity. A peasant revolt far away can be ignored for a while. A violent crowd a few streets from the palace cannot. So their street power becomes political power. And there's another reason. The core has become a social network, not just soldiers, sons of soldiers, friends of soldiers, business partners, neighborhood allies. The Janissary identity becomes a membership card. It opens doors, it gets you exemptions, it gets you leverage in disputes. It can protect you from taxes, it can protect you from prosecution. And once people realize that, they want in. That's how you get a core that grows in numbers without growing in quality.
because enrollment is no longer just recruitment, it's access.
So you start seeing Janissaries acting like a force that owns parts of the city, not officially, not on paper, but in real life. They insert themselves into commerce. They get involved in pricing. They interfere in guild politics. They run side businesses. And when they don't like a decision, they don't write a complaint. They show up as a crowd. They carry weapons. They make the decision change. This is also where the violence becomes part of a routine. If wages are late, they riot. If a reform threatens their privileges, they riot. If a grand vizier tries to discipline them, they riot. And because the empire has seen what happens when you confront them badly, officials often choose the easier path. Pay them, bribe them, give them a bonus, promise them something, postpone the reform, move the problem into the future. The state is basically paying protection money to its own soldiers. And there's a special detail in this era that tells you just how deep the distortion goes. Fire. Istanbul is a city of wood. Fires are constant. Fires are existential. They can wipe out neighborhoods. They can destroy fortunes. So firefighting matters. And Janissaries become heavily involved in fire brigades. They get influence over the pumps, the crews, the response. And once you have that influence, you have a new kind of leverage, because when the city is burning, people will pay anything. And that's where the stories come from. Stories about Janissaries negotiating prices while houses burn. Stories about protection in exchange for help. Stories about power that shows itself in the most cruelly practical way. Now, not every story needs to be taken literally to be meaningful. Sometimes cities create legends to express a truth about who dominates them. Whether every fire scene played out like a gangster movie is not the point. The point is that enough people believed it could happen. The point is the reputation. The point is the fear, because reputation becomes a form of control. And the Janissaries in this period develop a reputation for being untouchable. They also become a barrier to modernization in a very direct way, because any reform usually means one of two things. It means a new kind of army, or it means a new kind of administration that can tax and regulate more effectively. Both threaten Janissary privilege. A new army threatens their military monopoly. A stronger administration threatens their urban immunity. So they resist. They resist violently. And after Osman II, everyone knows the risk. Push too hard, and you might end up dead. This is why the empire begins to stagnate politically. It isn't just that the Ottomans fall behind in some abstract way. It's that inside the capital there is an armed class that benefits from things staying broken. They make money from corruption. They make money from exemptions. They make money from intimidation. They make money from the fact that the state is forced to bargain with them, and any serious reform threatens that revenue. Meanwhile, outside the empire, the world is changing. European states are building more disciplined armies. They are building standardized drill. They are improving artillery. They are building fiscal systems that can fund long wars. So the Ottomans face pressure from outside, and at the same time, their most privileged military institution is pressuring them from inside. That is a brutal squeeze, and the Janissaries become one of the main reasons the empire can't respond fast enough. So, by the end of this chapter, the Janissaries don't feel like a sword. They feel like a parasite. They feed on the state. They feed on the city. They feed on fear. They still wear the image of elite soldiers, but in daily life they act like street power. And street power is hard to remove because it isn't just an institution, it's people, it's livelihoods, it's networks. And that sets up the next stage of the story, because the empire cannot stay in that squeeze forever. Eventually, a ruler has to try reform again. Eventually, someone has to try building a modern army. Eventually, someone has to say, enough. And when that happens, the Janissaries don't just complain, they strike back.
Now the timeline moves into a world that feels sharper and faster. The late 18th century, the early 19th, the era when war is becoming more industrial in its logic. Bigger armies, more standardized training, more disciplined artillery, better logistics, more money pumped through the state just to keep troops moving. And in that environment, an empire that can't modernize its army is an empire that starts losing, not once, but repeatedly. The Ottomans don't lose because their soldiers suddenly forget how to fight. They lose because the system around fighting is changing. European powers are building permanent armies with standardized drill and officer education. They're creating fiscal systems that can fund long wars. They're creating bureaucracies that can support those wars. And the Ottoman military, especially the elite institutions that should be leading reform, are trapped in older habits. They're trapped in politics. They're trapped in privilege. This is the moment when the Janissaries stop being just a nuisance. They become a structural problem. They're expensive, they're politically powerful, they're deeply embedded in the capital, and they are hostile to change. So the empire faces an ugly equation. If you don't reform, you keep losing wars. If you do reform, the Janissaries may revolt. Either way, the empire bleeds. Into that equation steps Selim III. Selim is not a cartoon villain or a helpless victim. He's a reformer with a real agenda. He looks at the defeats and he sees the pattern. He sees that the old military machine is not enough, and he understands something important. You can't fix the Janissaries by yelling at them. You can't fix them by writing rules. The institution is too entrenched. The incentives are wrong. If you want a modern army, you need to build one. So Selim tries to do exactly that. He launches the Nizam-e-Jadid, the New Order, a new force trained and organized along more modern lines, a force with different discipline, different drill, different structure, and crucially, different loyalties. Selim wants officers who understand new tactics. He wants troops who can fight the kind of wars the empire is now facing, and he wants this new army to exist alongside the old one, at least at first, because he knows he can't smash the Janissaries head-on without risking civil war. But the Janissaries understand the logic immediately. They don't need a strategy memo to see the threat. A new army means their monopoly is over. A new army means the palace has options. A new army means the Janissaries can no longer hold the state hostage with the simple threat of street violence. And once you see the new order that way, you see why they respond the way they do. They don't respond with debate, they respond with force. Because the Janissaries, by this point, are not thinking like a military corps that serves the state. They're thinking like a corporate body that protects its privileges. They have pay, they have exemptions, they have businesses, they have political influence, they have a street presence, and the new order threatens all of it. It threatens their income, it threatens their status, it threatens their ability to intimidate the palace. And the moment a privileged institution feels its privileges slipping, it becomes aggressive. So the opposition grows. And it isn't just soldiers, it's also parts of the city that are tied to Janissary networks.
people who benefit from the old arrangement, people who fear the taxes and discipline that come with modernization. Reform is expensive. Reform requires money. Reform requires new rules, and new rules mean new losers. The Janissaries are the most obvious losers, but they are not the only ones. They become the spearhead of a wider resistance. Then the coup comes, and it's brutal. Selim's new ordered troops are attacked, reformist officials are attacked, loyalists are hunted. In the streets, the violence is intimate and ugly. This isn't a battlefield, this is a capital turning on itself. The Janissaries overthrow Selim. They replace him with a more compliant ruler. They smash the reform project, and Selim himself is killed. At that point, the empire is in a nightmare loop. Every time a ruler tries to modernize the army, the Janissaries revolt. Every time the Janissaries revolt, reform becomes more dangerous. Every time reform becomes more dangerous, the empire falls further behind. And the more the empire falls behind, the more urgent reform becomes. It's a trap. And the timing here matters, because this is not some distant medieval episode. This is the age of Napoleon. This is a period when European armies are demonstrating in real time what modern organization and artillery can do. This is when the map of Europe is being redrawn by military efficiency, and the Ottomans are stuck with an elite corps that is behaving like an internal veto power. So by the early 19th century, the empire is on the brink, not necessarily of immediate collapse in one dramatic day. Empires can stagger for a long time, but the direction is clear. The military needs reform, the administration needs reform, the finances need reform, and sitting inside the capital is an armed class that makes those reforms nearly impossible. This is why the Janissaries start looking less like soldiers and more like a parasite. They feed on the state, they extract pay and privileges, they block the changes that could save the empire. And whenever the palace tries to shift the system, they respond with violence. It's not just that they are outdated militarily, it's that they have become hostile to the future. So now you can feel the tension building toward the final act, because the empire cannot live in that trap forever. Eventually, a ruler is going to choose one option: either accept decline and keep bargaining with the Janissaries, or take the risk and destroy them. And that ruler is Mahmud II. But Mahmud doesn't rush. He watches. He learns. He understands what happened to Selim III. He understands what happened to Osman II. And he decides that if he is going to end the Janissaries, he has to do it in a way that leaves them no room to recover. Mahmud II is not the kind of ruler who walks into a trap with his eyes closed. He knows the history. He knows what happened to Osman II. He knows what happened to Selim III. He knows exactly what the Janissaries can do when they feel threatened. So if he's going to fight them, he can't fight them the way a reformer wishes he could. He has to fight them the way a survivor does. Patiently, quietly, with preparation, and with a plan that ends in one decisive, irreversible blow. Because by the 1820s, the Janissaries aren't just an outdated corps, they're a parallel power. They are a political veto. They are a street force inside the capital. They are a symbol of privilege. And they are one of the biggest reasons the empire can't modernize its military. Mahmud sees that. He also sees something else. The state is running out of time. Modern warfare is not slowing down so the Ottomans can catch up. The empire needs a new army. It needs disciplined troops. It needs artillery and drill and officers who can operate in the new reality. And that can't happen while the old core holds the palace hostage. So Mahmud does what earlier rulers couldn't. He builds his alternative first. He cultivates loyal forces. He develops artillery units that he trusts. He reorganizes parts of the military. He tests the mood in the city. He waits for the moment when the Janissaries will overplay their hand. Because if he moves too early, he risks being the next murdered reformer. If he moves at the right time, he can make the Janissaries look like the enemies of order. And then the moment arrives. In 1826, the Janissaries rebel. They gather. They make their statement in the way the city understands instantly. They overturn their cauldrons. They drag the symbols of their units into the streets. They declare, in their traditional language, that they reject what the Sultan is trying to do. Mahmud answers with something smarter than brute force. He answers with legitimacy. He frames the conflict as a religious and political choice for the city. He brings out the prophet's banner, the sacred standard, a symbol meant to rally loyal subjects and isolate rebels. It's a public message. The Sultan is not just arguing with soldiers. The Sultan is defending the state, defending the faith, defending order. And that matters because Mahmud needs the population and other power centers to hesitate before they side with the Janissaries. Then he moves, and he moves fast. The loyal artillery comes out. The new troops come out. The line is drawn, and the fighting is not somewhere far away on a frontier. It is in the capital. It is in the streets. It is at the barracks. This is the last battle of the Janissaries, and it happens at home. Their own stronghold becomes their prison. Their own central position, which gave them power for so long, now gives the Sultan the chance to finish them in one sweep. The cannons fire into the Janissary barracks. Buildings collapse. Men die in groups. Fires spread. The city becomes a battlefield. The violence is enormous. This isn't a clean arrest operation. It's a massacre and a purge. The leadership is hunted down. Surviving Janissaries are executed, imprisoned, exiled. The core is abolished. Their symbols are destroyed. Their lodges and networks are attacked. Their institutional memory is broken on purpose. Because Mahmud does not want a reform that can be reversed. He wants a death sentence. And after the smoke clears, the state names it something that tells you everything about how it wanted the story remembered. The auspicious incident, the fortunate event, a state victory framed as a blessing, not a tragedy, not a civil conflict, a necessary cleansing, a turning point. There's a grim geography to this too. Places associated with the core become places associated with punishment. In Thessaloniki, the White Tower carries an older memory, a reputation as the Bloody Tower, a place where executions happened. And that's part of the larger message. The Janissary era is over. The state is announcing it in the most physical way possible. Of course, not every former Janissary is killed. Some are absorbed into the new system. Some are judged useful. Some disappear into civilian life. But the institution itself, the Janissary Corps as a corporate body, is finished. And that matters because the Ottomans are not just removing a unit, they are removing a political actor. They are removing a tradition of rebellion. They are removing a centuries-old veto power. And here is the final irony. The Janissaries began as a tool built to centralize power. They were created to make the Sultan stronger. They were designed to be loyal slaves. They became strong enough to dominate the politics of the capital. They became strong enough to kill sultans. And in the end, They are destroyed in the name of saving the state they once expanded. So when we reach the conclusion, the question isn't only, were the Janissaries good or bad? That's too simple. The real question is what their story says about institutions, about elites, about power, about systems that succeed so hard they become untouchable. Because the Janissaries didn't collapse overnight. They rose, they delivered, they gained privileges, they resisted change, they turned inward, and finally they forced the state to choose between them and survival. That's why their legacy still feels modern. It's the story of an elite institution that becomes a political problem. It's the story of a weapon that refuses to be put down. And it's the story of what happens when the people created to protect a system decide they are the system. So that's the arc. Kidnapped children, manufactured loyalty, a brotherhood built around discipline, ritual, and a soup cauldron that somehow became a flag. Then slow privilege, then corruption, then politics, then blood in the streets of the capital, and finally cannons firing into the very barracks that once symbolized the Sultan's power. It's tempting to tell this story like a morality play. Brave soldiers become greedy parasites. The state finally restores order. The end. But real history is messier and honestly more interesting. Because the Janissaries weren't born evil. They were created. They were designed. They were an invention of government. And for a long time, they were a brilliant invention. Think about what the early Ottoman state achieved with them. It built a standing force when many of its rivals still relied on temporary coalitions. It created soldiers who were disciplined, trained, and psychologically tied to the ruler. It created a pipeline that could produce administrators as well as fighters. And it did this inside a multi-ethnic empire where loyalty was always a question. In that context, the Janissaries were not a mistake, they were a solution. The tragedy is that solutions can outlive the problems they were meant to solve. The Ottoman state built a core to avoid local power networks, and then the core became its own power network. The state built elite slaves to guarantee obedience, and then the elite part started outweighing the slave part. The state made them separate from society to keep them controllable, and then slowly the state let them merge back into society. Marriage, property, shops, guilds, streets. And once that happened, you couldn't treat them like a tool anymore. They were a constituency. And that's a pattern you can see in many empires, in many centuries. An elite institution earns privileges because it performs. Then it starts treating those privileges as a right. Then it starts protecting those privileges more fiercely than it protects the state. And at that point, reform becomes war. Was it necessary to destroy them in 1826? That's the uncomfortable question. Because the auspicious incident is a name chosen by the winners. It frames a massacre as salvation. And there's truth in that framing. The empire was locked in a trap. Modernization was being blocked by an armed class in the capital. Mahmud II didn't have a painless option. He could bargain and decline, or he could strike and risk chaos. He chose to strike. But the fact that he felt forced into that choice is the real lesson. Institutions that hold concentrated power rarely step aside voluntarily. They tend to fight for their place. They tend to defend their status with whatever tools they have. And when those tools include weapons and street presence, the conflict becomes brutal. The Janissaries also leave a cultural legacy.
their music, their imagery, their myths, the cauldron, the mustache, the marches, the stories that traveled across Europe, even the fear. For centuries, their name meant something. It meant discipline. It meant violence. It meant an empire that could appear at your walls with a soundtrack that made the world feel louder and darker. And yet, maybe the most lasting legacy is the paradox that sits at the center of the whole story. Elite slaves. A phrase that sounds impossible until you see it happen in real life. The Janissaries show that political power doesn't always come from birth. It can come from design, from training, from organization, from proximity to the center. And once that power exists, it develops its own interests. So if you're listening to this and thinking, okay, but what should I take away from it? Here's a simple question to end on. When a state creates an elite institution to protect itself, what safeguards exist to prevent that institution from becoming a threat? How do you make sure the people with the most training, the most cohesion, and the most access to violence never decide they deserve the throne? Because that's what the Janissaries ultimately force us to confront. They weren't just soldiers, they were a mirror. They reflected the strengths of the Ottoman system at its height, and they reflected its weaknesses as the world changed. They rose with the empire, they hardened with it, they corrupted with it, and when the empire tried to change, they tried to stop time. Time didn't stop, and neither did the cannons. Thank you so much for watching our video and supporting the channel. See you in the next episodes, and good night.